Tonight we walk a path worn smooth by a single pair of feet, centuries ago. You push open a heavy wooden gate, its iron hinges groaning in protest after years of disuse, and the sound of it closes behind you like a door slamming on the modern world. The air changes instantly, cooler, damper, thick with the smell of damp earth and something green and growing that you can't quite name. Overhead, the canopy of ancient oaks and hornbeams filters the late afternoon light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow that dance across your shoulders as you move deeper into the stillness. A thrush sings somewhere to your left, then stops, and the silence that rushes in to fill the space feels almost physical, pressing gently against your eardrums. You notice your own breathing for the first time in hours, maybe days, and you realize you've been holding tension in your jaw that you forgot was there. This is the 18th century, more or less, and you've just crossed the threshold into the world of England's most famous, or infamous, gentleman hermit. You probably won't survive this, of course, but not for the reasons you might expect. No one's going to poison you or run you through with a sword. The danger here is quieter, more insidious. You might find yourself envying a man who chose to spend 40 years completely alone, and that kind of envy has a way of following you home and sitting in the corner of your bedroom, watching you check your phone for the 300th time today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a clearing that doesn't look like it was designed so much as coaxed into existence, like the landscape itself decided one day to arrange itself into something approaching order. A small cottage hunkers against the far side, its walls made of local stone and its roof thick with moss that hangs down over the eaves in soft green curtains. Smoke curls from a chimney no bigger than your arm, thin and blue against the darker green of the trees, and you catch the faintest whiff of wood smoke mixed with something herbal, rosemary, maybe, or thyme. A vegetable patch sprawls to one side of the cottage, neat rows of cabbages and leeks and something with broad, dark leaves that you don't recognize, all of them growing with a vigor that seems almost aggressive. To the other side, an orchard of apple and pear trees stands in patient ranks, their branches heavy with fruit that no one seems to have bothered picking. The grass beneath your feet is thick and soft, uncut but somehow not unruly, as though it's been trained over decades to grow just so. A wooden bench sits under the largest oak, its surface worn smooth and dark with age and use, and you can see the faint impression of a seated figure worn into the wood. This is not a place of wildness, you realize. This is a place of profound, deliberate cultivation, not just of plants, but of silence, of attention, of a particular way of being in the world that has mostly vanished from the earth. The man who lives here, if lives is quite the word for what he does, is nowhere to be seen, but you feel his presence in every detail. The way the firewood is stacked in the cottage lean-to, each piece split to exactly the same thickness and arranged in a pattern that's almost hypnotic in its precision. The path of flat stones that leads from his door to the bench to the vegetable patch and back again, worn so smooth you can see the faint glitter of mica in the granite. A book lies face down on the bench, left there as though the reader merely stepped away for a moment and might return at any second, though the pages are slightly swollen with damp and the leather binding has started to curl at the corners. You resist the urge to pick it up, to see what a man alone for decades might choose to read, but the temptation is strong. This is the paradox you'll spend your time here wrestling with, the absolute privacy of this existence, and your own invasive, utterly human curiosity about it. Every object you see was chosen, placed, used by hands that have touched no others for years. Every stone in that path was laid by someone who had all the time in the world to consider exactly where it should go, who could spend an afternoon adjusting a single stone by a quarter inch until it sat just right, who had no schedule to keep and no one waiting for him anywhere. The thrush starts singing again, and this time you notice that another bird answers from deeper in the woods. A blackbird, maybe, with that same rich, fluting tone but a slightly different phrase. You find yourself listening to their conversation with an attention you rarely give to anything, tracking the call and response, the pauses, the way one bird seems to wait for the other to finish before beginning its own song. How long has it been since you really listened to birds? How long since you stood still anywhere long enough to hear anything except the buzz of your own thoughts and the digital chatter of a world that demands your attention in exchange for nothing you actually need? The sun has shifted while you've been standing here, the shadows lengthening and the light taking on that honeyed quality that comes just before evening. You should probably move, find the man, introduce yourself, explain why you've come. But the bench is right there, warm from the sun, and the birds are still singing, and for just a moment you let yourself imagine what it would be like to stay here, to let the path wear itself a little deeper under your own feet, to become as much a part of this place as the moss on the roof and the worn impression in the wood. You find him eventually, though not in any of the places you expected. You had imagined he might be inside the cottage, or tending his vegetables, or perhaps sitting on that worn wooden bench with a book in his hands. Instead, you follow a narrow track that leads away from the clearing, deeper into the woods, and there he is, stooped over something on the ground, his back to you, utterly still except for the slow, deliberate movement of one hand. You stop some distance away, suddenly aware of how loud your breathing sounds, how much you do not belong here. He hasn't heard you. He hasn't noticed anything except whatever has captured his attention on the forest floor. You watch for a long moment, feeling like an intruder at a private ritual, before he straightens up slowly, stiffly, the way a man does when he's been in one position too long and his joints have forgotten how to cooperate. He turns, and you see his face for the first time. It's not the face of a wild man or a religious ascetic, not hollow-cheeked and haunted like you might have expected from paintings of hermits. It's just a face, lined and weathered, yes, with the deep tan of someone who lives outdoors, but with eyes that are clear and calm and utterly unsurprised to find a stranger standing at the edge of his woods. He looks at you for a long moment, and you have the strange sensation that he's seeing not just you, but everything around you, the tree behind your shoulder, the bird in that tree, the angle of the light, the direction of the breeze. Then he smiles, a small, gentle thing that barely moves his mouth but somehow transforms his whole face, and gestures for you to follow him back toward the cottage. He doesn't speak. You're not sure he even can anymore, or whether he's simply forgotten how. This is the man who walked away. You know his story, or at least the outline of it, because that's why you're here, to understand what could possibly drive a person to abandon everything and everyone, to choose solitude so complete that it becomes a kind of second skin. His name was William, once, though he hasn't used it in decades. He was a younger son of a respectable family, the kind that had money enough for comfort but not quite enough for idleness. He studied law, briefly, and hated it with a passion that surprised even himself. He fell in love, or thought he did, with a girl whose name no one remembers now, and she married someone else, a man with land and prospects and a future that made sense. He watched his father die slowly, painfully, surrounded by doctors who couldn't help and family who didn't know what to say, and he saw how all the busyness of those final weeks, the visitors, the letters, the arguments over the will, somehow missed the point entirely. And one morning, without telling anyone where he was going or why, he simply walked out the door and kept walking until he found this place, this clearing in the woods that felt like it had been waiting for him his whole life. Historians still argue whether his departure was an act of courage or cowardice, a profound philosophical statement or simply a man running away from his problems in the most dramatic way possible. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. He didn't leave behind any manifestos or explanations, no diary entries justifying his choice to posterity. He just left, and the world kept spinning without him, and after a few years most people stopped wondering what had become of the strange young man who couldn't seem to handle ordinary life. But here's the thing about walking away. It's never as simple as it sounds. You can't just leave yourself behind. After all, every thought you've ever thought, every memory you've ever made, every habit and fear and desire you've accumulated over a lifetime, all of it follows you right out that door and settles into your new life like an unwanted houseguest who refuses to take the hint. William didn't escape anything by coming here. He just changed the conditions of the encounter, stripped away the distractions, made the battlefield smaller and more intimate. His demons didn't stay in London. They walked every step of the way with him, and they're still here, somewhere in the quiet of this clearing, waiting for him to stop running so they can finally have it out. He leads you to the bench under the oak and gestures for you to sit, then disappears into the cottage. You hear him moving around inside, the clink of pottery, the sound of water being poured. A moment later he emerges with 2 cups, simple earthenware things, and glazed and slightly misshapen, and hands one to you. The liquid inside is pale gold and smells faintly of chamomile and something else, something green and slightly bitter that you can't identify. He sits beside you on the bench, close enough that you can feel the warmth radiating from his body, and sips his own tea in silence. You want to ask him 1,000 questions. You want to know why he chose this, how he survives, whether he's lonely, whether he's happy. But the silence feels too full already, too complete, and you find yourself sipping your tea and watching the light shift through the leaves instead, waiting for him to speak first even though you're starting to suspect he never will. The tea is good. You hadn't expected that. It's not fancy or complicated, just warm and herbal and somehow perfectly right for this moment, this place. You finish it and set the cup down on the bench between you, and William picks it up and carries it back to the cottage without a word. You watch him go, noticing for the first time how carefully he moves, how each step seems considered and deliberate, as though he's learned to treat every action as a kind of meditation. There's no hurry in him, no restless energy, no sense that he'd rather be somewhere else doing something more important. He's exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he wants to do, and the peace of that realization settles over you like a blanket. You came here looking for answers, for explanations, for some formula you could take home and apply to your own frantic life. But sitting here on this bench, in this clearing, with this man who has chosen silence over everything else, you start to understand that the answer might be simpler than you thought. It might be as simple as walking away. And as impossible. You spend the next morning watching him build. Not construct, not assemble. Build, in the oldest sense of the word, the way your ancestors built, with hands and patience and an intimate knowledge of the materials they worked with. He's repairing a section of dry stone wall that borders his vegetable patch, the winter frost having loosened several stones and sent them tumbling into the cabbages below. You sit on an upturned bucket near the cottage door, trying to stay out of his way, and you watch as he selects each stone with a care that borders on reverence. He runs his fingers over its surface, turns it over in his hands, considers its shape and weight and the way it fits against the stones already in place. Sometimes he rejects one, setting it aside in a growing pile of maybes, and reaches for another. Sometimes he finds exactly what he needs and slots it into the gap with a satisfaction you can almost feel, the stone settling into place with a soft thunk that sounds like completion. This is the world he built, stone by stone, plant by plant, year by year. When he first arrived here, this clearing was just a clearing, rough grass, a few old trees, no sign that anyone had ever lived here or even passed through. He slept under that oak for the first month, wrapped in a blanket he'd carried on his back, eating wild greens and berries and the occasional rabbit he managed to catch in a simple snare. The cottage came later, a winter's project that stretched into spring and then summer, because he had to learn as he went, had to figure out how to cut and shape the stone, how to mix mortar that would hold, how to fashion a roof that wouldn't leak when the autumn rains came. He made mistakes, of course. Walls that leaned too far, a chimney that smoked terribly until he rebuilt it twice, a door that never quite fit its frame and still sticks on damp mornings. But every mistake taught him something, and every lesson became part of the structure, embedded in the walls like fossils in rock. You walk around the cottage while he works, running your hand along the stones, noticing things you missed yesterday. The way the window frames are slightly different sizes, as though he built them from memory rather than measurement. The small carved figure above the door, A face, you realize, worn almost smooth by weather, its features barely discernible but somehow still present, still watching. The collection of stones arranged along the windowsill, each one unusual in some way. A spiral fossil, a piece of quartz that catches the light, a fragment of something that might be Roman pottery, its edges rounded by centuries in the soil. This is his museum, his gallery, his record of a life lived in close attention to the small wonders most people never notice. He's been collecting these stones for 40 years, and you wonder if he remembers where each one came from, if each has a story attached, a memory of a particular afternoon and a particular patch of ground and a particular moment when something ordinary revealed itself as extraordinary. Historians still argue about whether his hermitage was a deliberate philosophical project or simply the accidental result of one man's temperament and circumstances. The truth, you suspect, is that the distinction doesn't matter much. Whether he intended it or not, he created something remarkable here, not just a place to live, but a complete alternative to the way most people live, a working model of a different relationship between a person and the world. Every choice he made, from the placement of that stone in the wall to the arrangement of plants in his vegetable patch, reflects a philosophy that was never written down but is carved into every surface, planted in every row, woven into the very fabric of this place. He believes, apparently, that things should be beautiful as well as useful, that a cabbage patch can be arranged with as much care as a formal garden, that a wall built well enough will stand for centuries after its builder is gone. He believes that work done slowly is work done better, that attention is a form of love, that the world reveals its secrets only to those patient enough to wait for them. The wall is nearly finished now, and he stands back to examine his work, tilting his head slightly the way a painter might study a canvas. He runs his hand along the top course of stones, feeling for any movement, any weakness. He finds a small gap and fusses with it for several minutes, selecting and rejecting tiny flakes of stone until he finds one that fits perfectly, that fills the space without disturbing the stones around it. Then he steps back again, nods once to himself, and turns away. The wall is done. It will last another 50 years, maybe longer, and when it finally falls it will be someone else's problem, someone else's opportunity to learn the patient language of stone. You look at your own hands, soft and uncalloused, and wonder what you've ever built that will outlast you, what you've ever made with the kind of care that expects nothing in return except the satisfaction of a job done right. He catches you looking at your hands and smiles that small smile again, then gestures toward the woods. You follow him along a path you haven't noticed before, winding between ancient oaks and through patches of fern that brush against your thighs like soft green hands. After a few minutes you emerge into another clearing, smaller than the first, and you stop short at what you see. It's a grove of young trees, maybe 100 of them, planted in careful rows that follow the natural contours of the land. But these aren't fruit trees or timber trees. They're something else, something stranger. Each one is different. Oak and ash and beech and holly, hazel and hawthorn and rowan and yew, all growing together in patterns that seem random until you look closer and realize they're not random at all. He's planted them in groups, in relationships, in conversations. A circle of oaks surrounds a single hawthorn. A line of ashes leads to a solitary yew. A grove within the grove, a puzzle within a puzzle, and you have no idea what it means or why he built it, only that it matters, that every tree was chosen and placed with the same care he gave to that wall. The day begins before the sun does, and you learn this because you're sleeping in a small lean-to attached to the cottage. A gesture of hospitality that probably cost him more than you realize, this sharing of his carefully constructed solitude. You wake to darkness and the sound of movement inside, the soft thump of feet on an earth floor, the whisper of cloth, the clink of metal against pottery. You lie still for a moment, disoriented by the absolute absence of light, and then you remember where you are and why, and you pull on your clothes and step outside to find him already at work. The sky is just beginning to lighten in the east, a faint grey glow behind the black silhouette of trees, and the air is cold enough to make you shiver and hug yourself and wonder how he manages in just a thin shirt and worn woolen breeches. He's at the well, drawing water, the rope creaking as he hauls up the bucket hand over hand with a rhythm that speaks of thousands of repetitions. He pours the water into a wooden yoke with 2 buckets, settles it across his shoulders, and walks toward the cottage without seeming to notice the weight. You follow him through the morning, because there's nothing else to do and because you want to understand how a day passes when there's nowhere to go and nothing that must be done. He feeds the fire first, adding small sticks and then larger ones with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly how much heat each piece of wood will give and how long it will last. He fills a kettle from one of the buckets and sets it near the flames to heat, then disappears outside again. You find him in the vegetable patch, moving slowly along the rows, his eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that makes you look too, trying to see what he sees. Pests, you realize. He's checking for damage, for the telltale signs of caterpillars or slugs or the various small creatures who would happily share his harvest if he let them. He finds something, a hole in a cabbage leaf, a trail of silver slime across a carrot top, and kneels down to examine it more closely. His fingers move gently among the leaves, turning them over, searching. He finds the caterpillar, a small green thing almost invisible against the leaf, and picks it off carefully and carries it to the edge of the woods and places it on a wild plant instead. Not killing, just relocating. Making a choice about what belongs where, about the boundaries between his cultivated world and the wild one beyond. By the time the sun actually appears, cresting the treetops and flooding the clearing with golden light, he's already done more physical labor than you typically do in a week. You feel vaguely embarrassed, standing there with your soft hands and your questions, watching him work. He doesn't seem to notice or care. He goes about his tasks with the same unhurried attention he gave to the wall yesterday, each action complete in itself, not a means to an end but an end in its own right. When he chops wood, he is wholly present in the chopping, the weight of the axe, the swing of his arms, the satisfying crack as the log splits. When he weeds the carrots, he is wholly present in the weeding. The feel of the soil, the distinction between wanted and unwanted plants, the gentle tug that releases a root without disturbing its neighbors. You've heard people talk about mindfulness, about being present in the moment, but you've never seen it lived so completely, so unconsciously. He's not trying to be mindful. He's just doing what needs to be done, and doing it with the full attention of someone who has nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. Historians still argue about whether such a life is sustainable for most people, or whether it requires a particular temperament that most of us simply don't possess. The question nags at you as you follow him through the morning, as you help where you can, carrying water, gathering fallen branches for firewood, picking the ripe beans he points out to you with a gesture. You're not built for this, you realize. Your mind keeps wandering to other things, to people you know, to problems waiting for you at home, to the phone you left behind that's probably buzzing with messages you'll never answer now. You catch yourself planning conversations, rehearsing arguments, worrying about things that haven't happened yet. He never does any of this. His mind seems to stay exactly where his body is, engaged with whatever task presents itself, empty of everything except the present moment. Is that something you could learn, given enough time? Or is it a gift you either have or don't, like perfect pitch or the ability to wiggle your ears? The afternoon brings a different rhythm. He sits on the bench under the oak for a long time, not doing anything that you can see, just sitting and looking out at the clearing and the woods beyond. You sit nearby, trying to be quiet, trying to see what he sees, but your legs get restless and your mind starts to wander, and after a while you get up and walk around and explore the edges of the clearing. When you come back, he hasn't moved. His eyes are half closed, his breathing slow and regular, and you wonder if he's sleeping or meditating or just thinking about nothing at all. A butterfly lands on his knee and sits there for a long moment, opening and closing its wings in the sun, and he doesn't move or react. The butterfly flies away. He still doesn't move. You sit back down and try again to be still, to be present, to let your mind empty itself of everything except the warmth of the sun and the sound of the wind in the trees. It's harder than it looks. Much harder. But for a moment, just a moment, you feel something shift, a loosening, a settling, a sense that maybe you could learn this after all, given enough time and enough silence and enough afternoons on a worn wooden bench with nothing to do and nowhere to be. Evening comes softly, the light fading gradually until the clearing is full of shadows and the first stars appear overhead. He lights a single candle inside the cottage. No more, because wax is precious and because he doesn't need more, has never needed more. You eat together in silence, a simple meal of bread and cheese and some kind of stew made from vegetables and herbs you can't identify. He cleans the dishes and puts them away, and then he sits by the fire and you sit across from him and the flames dance between you like a third presence, like a conversation conducted in a language you're only beginning to learn. You want to ask him about loneliness, about the long nights and the longer winters, about whether he ever regrets his choice. But the silence feels too precious to break, too hard won, and instead you just sit and watch the fire and let the questions wait for another day. Tomorrow, maybe. Or the day after. There's time here. There's always time. You notice on your third morning that he doesn't own a single book. This strikes you as odd, even disturbing, because you've always associated solitude with reading. All those images of hermits in their caves with a single worn volume, the Bible or the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius or some collection of ancient poetry. But his cottage contains no shelves, no stacked volumes in corners, no pages used to light the fire. Just the one book you saw on the bench that first day, which you now realize isn't a book at all but a bound journal, blank except for his own sparse notes. Records of when certain plants flowered, when the first frost came, when a particular bird returned to nest in the oak. You pick it up one afternoon while he's working in the orchard, turning the pages carefully, trying to decipher his cramped handwriting. It's not a diary in any conventional sense. He doesn't record his thoughts or feelings, doesn't reflect on his life or his choices. Just facts, observations, the barest notes about the world around him. April 12th, the hawthorn blossoms opened. May 3rd, a vixen with 3 cubs denned in the bank below the ash grove. October 17th, first hard frost, harvested the last of the apples. This is his library, you realize. Not paper and ink, but leaves and sky and the living world that surrounds him. He reads the weather the way you might read a newspaper, scanning the clouds each morning for news of what's to come. A red sky at dawn means wind and rain by afternoon. High, thin clouds like mares' tails mean a change within the day. The way the swallows fly, low and fast means rain approaching, high and leisurely means fair weather for a while yet. He knows these things the way you know the faces of your friends, instantly and without conscious thought, because he's been reading this particular text for 40 years and it never repeats itself, never becomes boring, always offers something new to notice and interpret and remember. You watch him one morning as he stands at the edge of the clearing, his face tilted up toward the sky, and you realize he's not just looking at the clouds, he's reading them, understanding them, placing them in the context of everything he's learned over decades of paying attention. The birds teach him other things. He knows when the nightingales will arrive in spring because he's watched them arrive for 40 springs. Knows that the first one always appears on or around April 15th, give or take a day depending on the weather. He knows which trees they prefer for nesting, which direction their nests face, how many eggs they typically lay and how many of those eggs typically survive to fledging. He's never written any of this down except in the barest notes, but it's all there in his mind, a vast encyclopedia of avian behavior accumulated through patient observation. When a new bird appears, a migrant blown off course, a species expanding its range northward as the climate warms, he notices immediately, marks it as different, watches it with the same careful attention he gives everything else. You ask him about this once, or try to, but he just looks at you with those calm eyes and then points to a tree where a small brown bird is singing, and you understand that the question has been answered without words. The bird is enough. The observation is enough. He doesn't need to record it or analyze it or share it with anyone. He just needs to see it, to know it, to let it become part of the vast web of knowledge that constitutes his entire relationship with the world. Historians still argue about whether such a life represents a form of profound wisdom or simply a refusal to engage with the complexities of human culture. The question hangs in the air as you follow him through the woods later that day, watching him stop to examine a patch of fungus on a fallen log, to run his fingers over the bark of a particular tree, to kneel and smell the earth in a spot that looks no different from any other spot. He's not looking for anything specific, you realize. He's just paying attention, the way you might scroll through your phone without any particular purpose, just checking to see what's there. The difference is that what's here is infinitely complex, infinitely various, always changing in ways both subtle and dramatic. A fallen log this year will be a different thing next year. Softer, more decayed, hosting different fungi and insects and mosses. A tree that stands tall today might be toppled by a storm next winter, creating a gap in the canopy that will change everything growing beneath it. A stream that runs clear in summer might flood its banks in autumn, depositing silt that will enrich the soil for years to come. He's not just observing a static world. He's watching a process, a story, a drama that unfolds on timescales ranging from seconds to centuries. The plants themselves form a kind of text, if you know how to read them. He shows you, without words, how the direction a tree's branches lean tells you about prevailing winds and the path of the sun. How the plants growing beneath it tell you about the soil, acid or alkaline, wet or dry, rich or poor. How the presence of certain wildflowers indicates ancient woodland, ground that's been forested for centuries, while others signal disturbance, places where trees have been cut and the land has changed. He knows which plants are edible and which are poisonous, which have medicinal uses and which are good for nothing except feeding the insects that feed the birds. He knows when to harvest each root and leaf and berry for maximum potency, knows how to dry and store them for winter use, knows which combinations create useful remedies and which create dangerous poisons. All of this knowledge lives in his head, passed down from no one, learned through experiment and observation and the kind of attention that most of us reserve for things that matter much less. That evening, sitting by the fire, you try to imagine what it would be like to carry all of this inside you. Not as information to be retrieved when needed, but as a living, breathing understanding of the place where you live. You know your own neighborhood, of course. You know which houses have friendly dogs and which have unfriendly owners, which streets are busy at which times, where to find the best coffee and the quickest route to the highway. But you don't know it the way he knows this place. You don't know the names of the trees that line your street, or the habits of the birds that nest in them, or the way the light falls on your front door at different times of year. You've never watched a single patch of ground for 40 years, never learned its rhythms and secrets and small daily dramas. And you wonder, sitting there in the firelight, whether this kind of knowledge might be more valuable than anything you've learned from books, whether reading the world directly might be a deeper form of literacy than anything you were taught in school. The fire crackles and settles, and he adds another log, and you watch the sparks rise toward the smoke hole and disappear into the night sky, and you think about all the things you don't know and all the time you have left to learn them. They come on a Tuesday, though Tuesday means nothing here, just another day, another page in the endless calendar of seasons and weather and the slow growth of things. You hear them before you see them, the sound of voices carrying through the woods like an invasion, like something that doesn't belong. He hears them too, you notice. His hands pause in their work, his mending a basket, weaving fresh willow shoots into the gaps where last year's have broken, and his eyes lift toward the sound, and something flickers across his face too quickly for you to read. Then he goes back to weaving, the same steady rhythm as before, as though nothing has changed. But something has changed. The quality of the silence has shifted, become watchful, expectant. You find yourself listening too, tracking the voices as they grow closer, trying to make out words through the rustle of leaves and the crunch of feet on fallen branches. There are 3 of them, You see when they finally emerge from the trees. A man and two women, dressed in clothes that look absurdly formal against the green simplicity of the woods. The man wears a powdered wig slightly askew from his walk through the undergrowth, and his coat is fine wool, dark blue with silver buttons that catch the light. The women wear dresses that must have been expensive once, though the hems are now stained with mud and torn in places where brambles caught them. They stop at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cottage, at the vegetable patch, at the two of you sitting there like figures in a painting. You see the disappointment on their faces, the way their eyes scan the scene for something more dramatic, more hermit-like, a cave, maybe, or a hair shirt, or some sign of the wild eccentricity they've come to witness. All they see is an old man mending a basket in the afternoon sun, and you can feel their letdown like a physical thing, a deflation of expectations. He doesn't rise to greet them, doesn't speak or gesture or acknowledge their presence in any way. Just keeps weaving, his fingers moving among the willow shoots, the basket slowly taking shape in his lap. The visitors stand there awkwardly for a long moment, exchanging glances, clearly unsure what to do next. Finally, the man clears his throat and steps forward, making a small bow in the general direction of the cottage. "Good day to you, sir," he says, his voice too loud in the quiet, too full of the confidence of someone used to being answered. "We've heard tales of a philosopher dwelling in these woods, and we've come to pay our respects and perhaps engage in some edifying conversation." Nothing. Not a flicker of response. The man's companions shift uncomfortably behind him, and you see one of the women hide a smile behind her hand. The man tries again, stepping closer, his voice taking on a slightly forced heartiness. "I am Mr. Throckmorton, of Throckmorton Hall in Surrey. These are my cousins, the Misses Ashworth. We are on a tour of the countryside and could not pass up the opportunity to meet such a celebrated recluse." Still nothing. The basket grows under his hands, row by row, and you realize with a small shock that he's not ignoring them out of rudeness or eccentricity. He simply has nothing to say. Their world, their concerns, their expectations, none of it has any meaning here, any connection to the life is built. They might as well be speaking a different language, or speaking to a different person, someone who doesn't exist anymore. You watch the visitors process this, watching their expressions shift from anticipation to confusion to something like offense. The Misses Ashworth whisper to each other behind their hands. Mr. Throckmorton's face reddens slightly above his white cravat. "I see," he says, his voice cooler now. "We have disturbed your meditations. I apologize." He turns to go, then stops, looking back at the old man with an expression you can't quite read. "I hope you find what you're looking for out here," he says, and there's genuine feeling in it now, something beneath the social awkwardness. "I truly do." They disappear back into the woods the way they came, their voices fading gradually until the silence returns, deeper now than before, more complete. He finishes the basket and sets it aside and looks at you, and for the first time you see something like humor in his eyes, a small glint of amusement at the absurdity of the encounter. Then he stands and walks toward the vegetable patch and kneels to examine the cabbages, and the moment passes, and you're left wondering whether you imagined it. But you didn't imagine the visitors, and you didn't imagine the way their presence changed something in the air, reminded you that this place is not as isolated as it seems. They'll talk about him now, you realize. They'll go back to their manor houses and their London salons and tell everyone about the strange old man in the woods who wouldn't speak to them. And the story will grow and change with each telling, and more visitors will come, drawn by curiosity or boredom or the hope of encountering something authentically unusual in a world that feels increasingly predictable. Historians still argue about whether he welcomed these visitors or resented them, whether the trickle of curious strangers that eventually became a stream was a burden or a secret comfort. You watch him among his cabbages, his hands moving gently among the leaves, and you can't tell either. He's impossible to read, this man who has spent so long alone that his face has become a kind of blank slate, reflecting nothing except what's directly in front of him. But you notice that he checks the path to the woods more often over the next few days, his eyes flicking toward it at odd moments, and you wonder if he's watching for more visitors or just making sure none appear. The silence feels different now, too. Not broken, exactly, but aware of itself, conscious of what it lacks and what it might lose. You find yourself listening for voices you don't want to hear, watching the tree line for movement that doesn't come. The woods have become a little less safe, a little less separate from the world beyond. And you realize, with a small pang of something that might be sympathy, that once people know about a place like this, they can't unknow it. Once they found their way here, they'll keep finding their way here, year after year, bringing their expectations and their disappointment and their endless, unanswerable questions about why a man would choose to live like this. The gate doesn't lock. There's no door to close against them. And even if there were, he probably wouldn't use it. That's not who he is. That's not what this place is for. The nights are the strangest part. You discover. During the day there's always something to do, some task that needs attention, some small piece of the endless work of keeping a place like this alive. But at night, when the fire burns low and the darkness presses against the small circle of light, there's nothing left except silence and the slow turning of thoughts. You lie in your lean-to, listening to the small sounds of the woods, an owl calling somewhere distant, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the creak of branches in the wind, and you wonder what he does with all this emptiness, all this time alone with his own mind. Does he think about the past, about the people he left behind, about the life he might have lived? Does he plan for the future? Worry about what will happen when he's too old to tend the garden, too weak to carry water from the well? Or has he somehow learned to empty his mind completely, to exist in a state of pure awareness with no past and no future, just the endless present moment stretching out like a calm sea? You get your answer one night when you can't sleep and you step outside to clear your head. The moon is nearly full, casting enough light to see by, and you notice him sitting on the bench under the oak. Not meditating, not sleeping, just sitting, his face tilted up toward the moon, his lips moving slightly as though he's talking to someone. You freeze, suddenly aware that you're intruding on something private, something not meant for witnesses. But he's already seen you, already turned his head, already gestured for you to come and sit beside him. You obey, settling onto the worn wood, and for a long time neither of you speaks. The moon rides high overhead, casting sharp shadows across the clearing, and the night air is cool and damp and full of the smell of earth and growing things. Then he speaks, and the sound of his voice startles you so much you almost fall off the bench. "I talk to myself," he says, and his voice is rough from disuse, the words coming slowly as though he has to search for each one. "Have done for years. Started as a way to remember how." He pauses, considering. Now it's more like company. Like there's someone else here, listening. He gestures vaguely at the darkness around them. "Sometimes I answer. Sometimes we argue. Sometimes we just sit quiet together, like now." You don't know what to say to this, so you say nothing, and he seems to appreciate that. After a moment he continues, his voice gaining a little strength with use. "They think it's madness, people who hear about it. Talking to yourself. But I've been alone longer than most marriages last, longer than most people live in one place with one family. The mind needs conversation. If there's no one else to provide it, it provides its own." This is the most you've heard him speak since you arrived, and you realize with a start that he's giving you something precious, a glimpse into the inner life he's built over decades of solitude. You want to ask him questions, to probe deeper, to understand how this internal dialogue works and whether it ever feels like enough. But you've learned enough by now to know that silence is often the best response, the one that invites more rather than shutting it down. You sit together under the moon, two figures on a worn wooden bench, and after a while he speaks again. The strange thing is, I'm not sure anymore which one is the real me. The one who speaks or the one who listens. They've been at it so long they've started to blur together, to become the same person. He laughs, a small dry sound with no humor in it. Maybe that's what happens when you're alone too long. You become your own audience, your own critic, your own friend. Historians still argue about whether prolonged solitude leads to enlightenment or madness, or whether those two things might be closer than we think. Sitting here in the moonlight, listening to a man describe his decades-long conversation with himself, you're not sure anymore either. There's something profoundly sane about the way he's adapted to his circumstances, found a way to meet his need for connection without betraying his commitment to solitude. But there's also something unsettling about it, something that makes you wonder what happens when the conversation turns dark, when the self you're talking to becomes accusatory or despairing, when the voice in your head stops being company and starts being a tormentor. You ask him about this, cautiously, and he's quiet for a long time before answering. There are bad nights, he admits finally. Nights when the voice won't stop, won't be reasonable, keeps bringing up things I'd rather forget. Things I did. Things I failed to do. People I left behind. He pauses, and in the moonlight you see his face working with some emotion you can't name. On those nights I go into the woods and walk until I'm too tired to think. Or I work until my hands are raw and my back aches and there's no energy left for anything except sleep. He looks at you, and for a moment you see the weight of all those years, all those nights, all those battles with his own mind. It passes. It always passes. The bad nights, the bad thoughts, they're like storms. They blow through and then they're gone and the sky clears and you wonder why you were so afraid. He shrugs, a small movement in the darkness. You learn to wait them out. That's the main thing you learn out here. How to wait. You think about this as the moon tracks slowly across the sky and the night grows colder. Waiting. It's not something you're good at, not something anyone you know is good at. You're all so busy filling every moment with something. With work, with entertainment, with conversation, with the endless scroll of information that pours through your phones like water through a sieve. The idea of just waiting, of letting time pass without trying to use it, feels almost foreign, almost impossible. But here's a man who spent 40 years waiting, for seeds to sprout, for fruit to ripen, for storms to pass, for his own mind to settle into something approaching peace. And somehow, against all odds, it's worked. He's still here. Still sane, if that's the right word. Still able to sit under a moon with a stranger and talk about the voice in his head as though it were an old friend, which maybe it is, by now. The sky begins to lighten in the east, the first pale glow of dawn behind the trees, and you realize you've sat here all night without noticing. He notices too, and stands slowly, stiffly, and looks down at you with something that might be gratitude or might just be acknowledgement. Thank you for listening, he says. It helps, sometimes, having someone real to talk to. He walks toward the cottage, then stops and turns back. You can stay as long as you need. I don't mind the company. And then he's gone, disappeared into the darkness of his doorway, and you're left alone with the dawn and the birds beginning to sing and the strange, unsettling, oddly comforting knowledge that you've just spent the night listening to a man talk to himself, and that for a little while, you were part of the conversation too. You learn to eat differently here. It's not just the food itself, though that's different enough, simple and honest and tasting of nothing except itself, but the whole relationship with eating, the way meals arrive and are consumed and disappear without ceremony or complaint. Breakfast is bread, usually, baked once a week in the outdoor oven he built himself, dense and dark and chewy, with a crust that cracks when you break it and an interior that smells of yeast and something else, something almost sweet. There's butter too, when the cow he keeps in a small pasture beyond the orchard is giving enough, and sometimes honey from the hives he maintains in a sunny clearing, and always tea made from herbs gathered that morning or dried from last season. You eat sitting on the bench or standing by the fire or walking slowly through the garden, whichever feels right in the moment. There are no tables here, no chairs arranged around a board, no rituals except the simple fact of nourishment. Lunch is whatever the garden provides at that moment, and you learn to eat with the seasons in a way you never have before. In spring there are tender greens, lettuce and sorrel and the first young leaves of dandelion, gathered before they turn bitter, and the last of the stored apples from the previous autumn, their skins wrinkled but their flesh still sweet. Summer brings beans and peas and the first new potatoes, small and waxy and boiled with mint from beside the stream. Autumn is abundance, the garden spilling over with more than 2 people could possibly eat. Tomatoes and courgettes and runner beans, onions and garlic and leeks, apples and pears and plums from the orchard, blackberries from the hedgerows, mushrooms from the woods if you know which ones are safe. And winter is storage, the careful rationing of what was preserved in summer and autumn, pickled beans and dried apples and onions hanging in nets from the cottage rafters, root vegetables buried in sand in the cellar, cheese aging on wooden shelves, the last of the honey thickened almost to crystal. He shows you where everything comes from, not with words but with gestures, with the way his hands move among the plants. You follow him through the garden one morning and he stops at each bed, each row, each individual plant that needs attention, and you begin to understand that this is not just food production but a kind of relationship, a conversation conducted over years between a man and the things he grows. He knows which beans need picking today and which can wait until tomorrow. He knows which apples will keep through winter and which must be eaten now. He knows which herbs are at their peak for drying and which are better used fresh. All of this knowledge lives in his hands, in his eyes, in the accumulated experience of 40 growing seasons, 40 springs and summers and autumns and winters of watching and waiting and learning. The garden is also his pharmacy, and you learn this the hard way when you cut your hand on a broken pot and he disappears into the cottage and returns with a poultice of crushed leaves that stops the bleeding and eases the pain within minutes. You ask him what it is, and he points to a plant growing near the cottage door. Comfrey, you learn later, though at the time it's just a plant with broad hairy leaves and small purple flowers. He shows you others as the days pass, building your vocabulary of usefulness without ever saying a word. Yarrow for wounds, its feathery leaves dried and powdered to sprinkle on cuts that won't stop bleeding. Chamomile for sleeplessness, the small daisy-like flowers steeped in hot water to make a tea that tastes of apples and calm. Willow bark for pain and fever, chewed or brewed, containing the same medicine that will one day be synthesized into aspirin. Feverfew for headaches, planted near the door so he can grab a leaf on his way out each morning. Garlic for almost everything, infection, colds, high blood pressure, even, he seems to believe, for keeping away the darker thoughts that sometimes gather in the corners of his mind. Historians still argue about whether such self-sufficiency represents freedom or a different kind of bondage, whether growing your own food and medicine liberates you from the market or simply chains you to the soil in a different way. You think about this as you help him dig potatoes one afternoon, your back aching from the unaccustomed labor, your hands blistered from the rough handle of the fork. There's something profoundly satisfying about eating food you've helped to grow, about knowing exactly where each meal comes from and what went into producing it. But there's also something exhausting about it, something that makes you appreciate the convenience of shops and markets and the division of labor that allows most people to trade their specialized skills for the specialized skills of others. He doesn't seem to find it exhausting, though. Or if he does, he's learned to accept exhaustion as simply another part of life, another thing to be experienced and released and experienced again. The garden feeds more than just bodies. You realize. It feeds something else, something harder to name. When you spend an afternoon weeding the carrots, your hands in the soil, your face in the sun, your mind empty of everything except the task in front of you, something happens that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The boundaries between you and the garden start to blur. You're not just working on it anymore. You're part of it, part of the endless cycle of growth and decay and renewal that defines this place. The weeds you pull will rot down into compost that will feed next year's carrots. The carrots you thin will become part of tonight's dinner, will become you, will become energy for tomorrow's work. The line between eater and eaten, between cultivator and cultivated, starts to seem less important than you once thought. You're all part of the same thing, the same slow turning of matter into life and life back into matter. Evening comes and you eat together in silence, a stew made from the potatoes you dug and the leeks you pulled and the herbs you gathered, thickened with barley from a sack in the corner and flavored with salt from a block he trades for once a year with a farmer who lives 2 valleys away. You've never tasted anything so good, though you can't say exactly why. Maybe it's the work you put into it, the hours in the sun and soil that earned this meal. Maybe it's the simplicity, the way each ingredient tastes exactly like itself without any sauce or seasoning to disguise it. Maybe it's just the context, the silence and the firelight and the presence of this strange old man who has become, over the past days, something like a friend. You finish your stew and sit back, feeling full in a way that has nothing to do with food, and he looks at you across the fire and for just a moment you could swear he's smiling. The news reaches you like weather, like something carried on the wind that you can't quite see but can feel in the way the atmosphere changes. It comes first as a letter, delivered by a boy on a horse who seems profoundly confused by what is found. A cottage in the woods, an old man who won't speak, a stranger who accepts the folded paper with hands that suddenly feel too large and too clumsy. The boy rides away quickly, relieved to escape this place that doesn't fit any of his expectations, and you stand there holding the letter like it might explode. It's addressed to him, of course, in a flowing hand you don't recognize, and you carry it to where he's working in the orchard and hold it out to him. He looks at it for a long moment, then at you, then takes it and tucks it into his pocket without opening it. You want to ask what it says, who it's from, why he doesn't read it. But you've learned by now that some questions don't need answers, or won't get them if they do. The letter sits in his pocket all day, a visible weight against his thigh, and you catch him touching it sometimes when he thinks you're not looking. That evening by the fire he finally takes it out, turns it over in his hands, holds it close to the flame to read by its light. His lips move slightly as he reads, and you watch his face for some sign of what the words contain, but his expression doesn't change. When he finishes, he folds the letter carefully along its original creases and holds it in the fire until it catches, until the flames consume it entirely, until there's nothing left but ash that crumbles at his touch. He looks at you across the fire, and for the first time since you arrived he seems to want to speak, to explain, to share whatever weight that letter carried into his solitude. But the words don't come, or won't come, and after a long moment he just shakes his head slightly and adds another log to the fire and the moment passes. More letters follow over the next weeks, carried by more boys on more horses, each one received and pocketed and eventually burned unread or read and then burned, you can never tell which. Word has spread, you realize. The visitors who found their way here, the Throckmortons and Ashworths and others like them, have been talking. The hermit in the woods has become a topic of conversation in drawing rooms and coffee houses, a curiosity to be discussed and debated and, inevitably, written about. You imagine the letters they must be sending each other. Have you heard about the strange man in Surrey who lives completely alone? They say he hasn't spoken in decades. They say he grows all his own food and makes his own clothes and never sees another soul. They say he's a philosopher, a saint, a madman, a fraud. The stories multiply and mutate, each telling adding new details, new interpretations, new layers of meaning that have nothing to do with the reality of this quiet place and this quiet man. The coffee houses of London are where the story really takes hold. You learn later from a visitor who arrives with more news than any letter could contain. He's a writer, this one, a journalist, though that word doesn't quite exist yet, and he's come to see for himself, to separate fact from fiction, to write an account that will satisfy the hunger of readers who can't get enough of this strange tale. He's different from the other visitors, more persistent, more willing to wait. He sits on the bench for an entire day without moving, watching the old man work, taking notes in a small leather book with a pencil he sharpens obsessively with a small knife. He tries to ask questions, gets no answers, keeps trying. By evening he's frustrated but also something else. Impressed, you think, or at least intrigued by a subject who refuses to be a subject, who won't perform or explain or even acknowledge his audience. Historians still argue about whether the hermit's fame was something he wanted or something that happened to him, whether he secretly craved the attention or genuinely didn't care. You watch him during those weeks when the visitors become more frequent, when the path to the clearing starts to wear wider from all the feet that travel it, and you can't tell either. He goes about his work the same as always, tending the garden and mending the walls and gathering wood for the fire. He doesn't hide when visitors come, but he doesn't welcome them either. He simply continues whatever he was doing, as though they aren't there, as though their presence makes no difference to anything. Sometimes they stay for hours, watching him work, whispering to each other, waiting for something to happen that never does. Sometimes they leave disappointed, muttering about wasted journeys and eccentric old men. Sometimes they leave transformed, or so they claim, speaking of the peace they felt in this place, the strange stillness that settled over them as they watched a man simply live his life without reference to their expectations. The writer's account appears eventually, printed in one of those new magazines that seem to be springing up everywhere. You never see it, but you hear about it from a later visitor, who brings a copy and reads passages aloud while the old man ignores him completely. It's a strange piece, you gather, part description, part meditation, part invention. The writer has filled in the gaps with his own imaginings, has given the hermit thoughts and feelings and a backstory that may or may not bear any relation to the truth. He's made him into a character, a symbol, a figure who represents something larger than himself. The hermit in the story is wise and tragic and profound, a man who has seen through the illusions of society and chosen something better. The hermit in the clearing is just an old man weeding his carrots, and the gap between the two is wide enough to drive a coach through. But the story spreads anyway, faster now, carried by the magazine's readers and by the conversations it sparks. More visitors come, expecting to meet the figure from the pages. They find the old man instead, and you watch their faces as they try to reconcile the two, as they search for profundity in the ordinary movements of ordinary life, as they gradually realize that the hermit they came to see doesn't exist anywhere except in their own imaginations. You notice the change first in the visitors themselves. They arrive differently now, not just curious travelers or bored gentry looking for diversion, but people with a purpose, with expectations shaped by something more than vague rumor. They carry magazines in their hands, or folded newspapers, or letters from friends who've read about this place and insisted they must see it for themselves. They ask different questions too, when they bother asking at all. Not who are you or why do you live here, but things like, do you find that solitude clarifies the mind, or have you discovered the secret of happiness, or what would you say to those who seek to follow your example? Questions that assume he has answers, that assume his life is a philosophy rather than just a life, that turn a man into a lesson and a clearing into a classroom. He ignores these questions the same way he ignored the others, with the same patient attention to whatever task occupies his hands, but you can feel the shift in the air, the way his silence has become something people interpret rather than simply experience. The fashion spreads, as fashions do. You hear about it from a visitor who arrives already dressed for the part, a rough wool coat instead of fine broadcloth, sturdy boots instead of buckled shoes, a walking stick cut from a hazel branch instead of a polished cane. He's a gentleman, you can tell from his speech and his bearing, but is trying to look like something else, something simpler and closer to the earth. He's come to study the hermit, he says, to learn from him, to understand how to live as he lives. He stays for 3 days, sleeping in a tent he pitched at the edge of the clearing, following the old man everywhere, taking notes in a book even thicker than the journalists. He asks endless questions, most of them unanswerable, And when he finally leaves, he shakes the hermit's hand with an emotion that looks almost like reverence. You never see him again, but you hear later that he's built his own hermitage on his estate in Kent, a small cottage in a secluded corner of his woods where he retreats for a few weeks each year to live simply and contemplate eternal truths. He's not alone there, of course. He has servants to bring him meals and maintain the garden and make sure the roof doesn't leak. But it's the thought that counts, apparently, the gesture toward a different way of being. He's not the only one. As the months pass and the hermit's fame grows, you hear of others, landowners up and down the country who are adding hermitages to their estates, sometimes as genuine retreats, sometimes as ornamental follies, sometimes as conversation pieces to amuse their guests. A few of them actually hire men to live in these hermitages, paying them to dress in rough robes and look contemplative when visitors approach. The advertisements are wonderful things. You learn later, when you manage to see some of them. Wanted: a hermit for a gentleman's estate. Must be presentable, willing to grow a long beard, and able to remain silent in the presence of visitors. Comfortable cottage provided, with a small garden. References required. It's all so perfectly, absurdly English, this attempt to purchase authenticity, to manufacture the real by paying someone to perform it. You wonder what the real hermit would make of it, this strange echo of his life being played out on country estates by men who go home at night to their wives and children and ordinary lives. Historians still argue about whether the hermit craze of the late 18th century was a genuine philosophical movement or simply another expression of the English upper class's endless capacity for expensive whimsy. Sitting here in the clearing, watching the old man go about his work while visitors arrive expecting to find a sage and find only a gardener, you're inclined to think it's mostly the latter. But there's something else going on too, something harder to dismiss. The visitors keep coming, after all, and not all of them are wealthy or fashionable or looking for a performance. Some of them are ordinary people, tradesmen and farmers and servants, people who've walked miles on their day off to see this place, this man, this life that seems to offer something they can't find anywhere else. They stand at the edge of the clearing, not approaching, not asking questions, just watching. Sometimes they stay for an hour, sometimes for a whole afternoon. Then they leave, quietly, and you never see them again. You don't know what they're looking for or whether they find it. But they keep coming, week after week, year after year, and their presence changes the clearing in ways you're only beginning to understand. The old man himself seems unchanged by all of this, or at least no more changed than he's always been changing, slowly, like a tree growing or a stone weathering. He still rises before dawn and works until dark. He still tends his garden and mends his walls and talks to himself by moonlight. He still accepts visitors without welcoming them, ignores questions without answering them, goes about his life as though the world beyond his hedge has ceased to exist. But you notice small differences now, things you might have missed if you hadn't spent so long watching him. The way he sometimes pauses in his work and looks toward the path, as though listening for something. The way he started leaving a cup of water on the bench, in case a visitor arrives tired and thirsty. The way he occasionally catches your eye when strangers appear, and in that glance you see something you can't quite name. Amusement, maybe, or resignation, or just acknowledgement that things have changed and will keep changing and there's nothing to be done about it except keep living as he's always lived. The fashion for hermitages will pass, eventually. The visitors will stop coming, or come less often, or find some new curiosity to occupy their attention. The hired hermits will go back to their ordinary lives, and the ornamental cottages will fall into disrepair, and the whole strange episode will become a footnote in histories of the period. But he'll still be here, in this clearing, living this life, waiting for whatever comes next with the same patient attention he's brought to everything else. The world can do what it likes. He's not going anywhere. The winter is when you see it most clearly, the shadow that lives alongside the light in this place. Not all the time, not even most of the time, but enough to remind you that solitude is not just peace and contemplation and afternoons in the sun. Winter here is hard. The days shorten until there's barely time to do the necessary work before darkness falls again. The cold seeps through walls and clothes and skin, settles into bones, becomes a companion that never quite leaves. The garden sleeps under a blanket of frost, offering nothing, and you live on what was stored in the autumn. Root vegetables softening in their sand, apples wrinkling on their shelves, the last of the salted meat growing stronger in flavor with each passing week. The birds are mostly gone, migrated, or hidden, and the silence that descends is different from summer silence. Heavier, more absolute, more likely to press against your ears until you hear things that aren't there. You watch him during these months, and you see the toll it takes. Not in anything dramatic. No breakdowns, no outbursts, no sudden decisions to abandon this life and return to the world. Just a slowing, a quieting, a retreat inward that mirrors the retreat of the world outside. He moves more slowly, as though the cold has gotten into his joints and made each action a conscious choice rather than a habit. He sits longer by the fire in the evenings, staring into the flames with an expression you can't read, sometimes not moving for hours at a time. He talks to himself more, you notice, or maybe just louder, his voice carrying through the thin walls of the cottage at night when you're trying to sleep. You can't make out the words, but the tone is different from summer's conversations. More urgent, more troubled, less like company and more like argument. One night you wake to find him gone. The fire has burned low, the cottage empty, his bed cold for hours. You pull on your coat and step outside, the cold hitting you like a physical blow, and you see his footprints in the frost leading toward the woods. You follow them, not sure why, not sure what you'll find. The moon is thin, barely a sliver, and you stumble more than once on roots and rocks hidden in the darkness. The footprints lead to the grove of young trees he planted years ago, the strange arrangement of species that you still don't fully understand, and there he is, sitting on the frozen ground with his back against the central hawthorn, his face lifted toward the invisible stars, his lips moving in that same urgent, troubled monologue. You stop at the edge of the grove, suddenly aware that this is not a moment for witnesses, but has already seen you, already gestured for you to approach, already made space for you on the cold ground beside him. Couldn't sleep, he says, his voice rough and tired. Happens sometimes in winter. The darkness gets inside and won't let go. He's quiet for a moment, and in the starlight you can see that his face is wet, with frost or tears, you can't tell which. I think about them, you know, the people I left behind. I wonder what happened to them, whether they're alive or dead, whether they ever think about me. He laughs, a sound with no humor in it. Probably not. Why would they? I've been gone longer than most of them were alive. He turns to look at you, and in the darkness his eyes seem to hold all the weight of 40 winters, 40 years of nights like this, 40 years of wondering and regretting and missing people who may not even remember his name. Historians still argue about whether his choice brought him happiness or simply a different kind of suffering, whether the peace he found was worth the price he paid. Sitting here on the frozen ground, watching a man struggle with demons that have been gathering for decades, you're not sure anymore that happiness is even the right question. He's not happy, not in any way you'd recognize. But he's not unhappy either, not in the way you've been unhappy, with that restless dissatisfaction that comes from wanting things to be different than they are. He's something else entirely, someone who's made a choice and lived with it so long that the choice has become irrelevant, just another fact about the world like the turning of seasons or the phases of the moon. The loneliness is real. You can see that now. The doubt is real. The moments when he wonders if he's wasted his life, if any of it mattered, if he'll die alone in this clearing and not be found for weeks, all of it is real. But so is the peace, the satisfaction, the sense of having lived in accordance with something deeper than social expectation. They exist together, these two things, like light and shadow, like summer and winter, like the growth of spring and the decay of autumn. You can't have one without the other here. He stands eventually, stiffly, and you help him back to the cottage, his arm thin and surprisingly light through the layers of clothing. He's older than you realized, you think. Older than he seemed in summer, when the sun and work kept him strong and the days were long enough to outrun the darkness. Winter strips away the pretense, reveals what's underneath. A man who's been alone for most of his life, who's made a world out of silence and solitude, who's paid for that world with everything he might have been and done and loved. He settles by the fire and you build it up, adding wood until the flames are high enough to chase the cold from the corners of the room. He thanks you, or you think he does. It's hard to tell with him, hard to know what counts as thanks and what's just acknowledgement of the way things are. You sit together until dawn, not speaking, just sharing the fire and the silence and the slowly lightening sky. And when the sun finally appears, thin and pale through the winter clouds, he looks at you and nods once, and you know that whatever happened in the night has passed, for now. The shadow will return. It always returns. But so will the light, and that's enough. That has to be enough. The letters keep arriving, even in winter, though fewer now because the roads are bad and the boys on horses are less willing to brave the cold. You bring them to him when they come, and he takes them with the same quiet acceptance, the same ritual of pocketing and ignoring and eventually burning. But one day he surprises you by holding one out, offering it to you with a look that might be invitation or might just be exhaustion. You take it carefully, aware that you're being allowed into territory you've never entered before. The paper is fine quality, thick and slightly cream-colored, and the handwriting is elegant. A woman's hand, you think, though you're not sure why. You read it slowly, aware of his eyes on you, aware that this matters in ways you don't fully understand. It's from his sister. You piece this together from references scattered through the graceful sentences, childhood memories, shared jokes, the names of parents long dead. She's old now, she writes, older than she ever expected to be, and she spent most of her life wondering what became of him, whether he's alive or dead, whether he ever thinks of her. She's heard the stories, of course, everyone has, by now, and she's come to believe that the famous hermit of Surrey must be her long-lost brother. She's not asking him to return, she writes. She's not asking for anything, really, except to know that he's real, that he exists, that the brother she loved as a child is still somewhere in the world. She's included a sketch, a small thing done from memory. 2 children in a garden, a boy and a girl, their faces young and hopeful and full of a future that hasn't happened yet. You look at it for a long time, then at him, and you don't know what to say. He takes the letter back when you've finished, folds it carefully, and tucks it into the same pocket where all the others have gone. But he doesn't burn it that night, or the next night, or the night after. You notice him taking it out sometimes, looking at it, touching the sketch with fingers that have grown rough and knotted over decades of work. He doesn't speak of it, doesn't explain, doesn't invite your questions. But the letter stays, and you understand that this one is different. This one matters in ways the others didn't. This one is from before, from the life he left behind, from a person who loved him before he became who he is. You wonder if he'll answer it, if he even knows how to anymore. Writing requires a kind of engagement with the world that has spent 40 years unlearning, a reaching out that goes against everything this place has taught him. But not answering requires something too, a closing of the door, a final refusal that feels different now that the person on the other side has a face and a name and a handful of shared memories. Weeks pass, and the letter stays in his pocket, growing worn at the edges from all the times he's taken it out and looked at it. You watch him struggle with it, this unprecedented choice between 2 kinds of silence. The silence of not answering and the silence of answering, which would break something fundamental in the life he's built. You want to help, to advise, to tell him what you think he should do. But you've learned by now that your role here is not to advise but to witness, to be present for whatever choice he makes without trying to influence it. So you watch, and you wait, and you wonder what you would do in his place, And you're grateful you'll never have to find out. Historians still argue about whether he ever responded to any of the letters he received, whether the man who refused to speak to visitors might have been willing to write to those who reached out across the distances of time and space. You'll never know, you realize. You'll leave this place eventually, go back to your own life, and you'll never know what happened to that letter or the sister who wrote it or the brother who carried it in his pocket for weeks without answering. But you suspect, watching him one evening as he sits by the fire with the paper in his hands, that the answer doesn't matter as much as you once thought. What matters is that he kept it. What matters is that he looked at it, again and again, letting it remind him of who he was before he became who he is. What matters is that somewhere in the silence of this place, a connection still exists. Thin as a thread, fragile as old paper, but real. He hasn't cut it. He hasn't burned it. He's just holding it, for now, and that's enough. The spring thaw comes eventually, and with it more visitors, more letters, more demands on a man who wants nothing except to be left alone with his garden and his silence. But something has shifted over the winter, some small adjustment in his relationship with the world beyond his hedge. He still doesn't answer letters, still doesn't speak to visitors, still goes about his work as though none of it exists. But you notice that he keeps that particular letter now in a small wooden box on the shelf above his bed, next to the stones he's collected and the dried herbs and the other small treasures of a lifetime. He never looks at it anymore. Not that you've seen. But it's there, a presence in the room, a reminder that he was once someone else, someone with a sister and a childhood and a life that didn't begin in this clearing. And sometimes, late at night, when the fire has burned low and you're both sitting in the darkness, you think you can hear him whispering to it, telling it things he's never told anyone, holding a conversation across decades with a person who may not even be alive anymore. You pretend not to notice. Some silences deserve to be respected. The years pass differently here. You notice this most clearly when you look at the trees, the ones he planted when he first arrived, now grown tall enough to overshadow the cottage, their trunks thick and their branches spreading wide. You've been here long enough to see the seasons turn more than once, to watch the garden die back and revive and die back again, to feel the slow accumulation of time in your own body, the way the work that was hard at first has become familiar, almost easy. But the trees show it best. They've grown while you weren't looking, added rings in the darkness of each winter, reached a little higher toward the sun each spring. He's grown too, though in a different direction. He's smaller now than when you arrived, or seems so, his back more bent, his steps shorter, his hands more knotted with the arthritis that comes to everyone who lives long enough outdoors. But his eyes are the same, still clear and calm and full of that patient attention that has defined his whole life here. The garden has changed too, though you hadn't noticed until you stopped to really look. Some of the original fruit trees have died, replaced by saplings he started from their seeds years ago. The vegetable patch has shifted slightly, the beds rearranged to catch the sun better as the surrounding trees have grown and changed the light. The wall you watched him repair that first year has been repaired again, and again, different stones each time but the same patient attention to the fit, the same satisfaction when each one settles into place. Nothing stays the same here, you realize. That's the thing you missed when you first arrived, when you thought this place was static, unchanging, frozen in some eternal present. It changes constantly, but on a time scale that's hard to perceive unless you're paying attention, unless you're here long enough to see the patterns beneath the surface. He's teaching you, though he'd never call it that. Teaching you to see the small changes, the daily differences that accumulate into years and decades. Teaching you to read the garden's needs before they become emergencies, to notice when a tree is struggling before it's too late to help, to understand that decay and death are as much a part of this place as growth and life. You've learned to compost, to turn waste into wealth, to see the beauty in a fallen log as it slowly returns to soil. You've learned to prune, to cut back in order to strengthen, to accept that some things must be removed so others can flourish. You've learned to wait, for seeds to sprout, for fruit to ripen, for wounds to heal, for grief to soften into something you can carry without it breaking you. These are not lessons he's taught you directly. They're just things you've absorbed, over time, by watching and doing and being here. Historians still argue about whether such a life represents a form of wisdom or simply a long, slow avoidance of everything difficult and complex about human existence. You think about this as you watch him struggle to lift a bucket that he used to carry easily, as you see him pause to catch his breath after climbing the slope from the well, as you notice the way his hands shake sometimes when he's trying to thread a needle or tie a knot. He's old now. Really old, in ways that can't be ignored or denied. And you wonder, watching him, whether he regrets anything. Whether he wishes he'd had children to help him now, or a wife to share the burden, or simply a younger body that hadn't spent 40 years working outdoors in all weathers. But he doesn't seem to regret anything. He just keeps going, doing what needs to be done, adapting to his limitations the way he's adapted to everything else. Slowly, patiently, with the same attention he's brought to every task for as long as you've known him. The visitors have mostly stopped coming. The fashion for hermits passed long ago, replaced by other fashions, other curiosities. The journalists moved on to newer stories. The seekers found other sages. Even the curious travelers, the ones who came just to see something unusual, have found other destinations. You and he are alone here now. Truly alone, in a way you weren't even in the depths of those first winters. And there's something peaceful about it. Something right. The path to the clearing has grown over in places, the way narrowing until you have to push through branches that once arched overhead. The cottage has settled deeper into its foundations, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, the door sticking more than ever on damp mornings. Everything is aging together. The man, the garden, the buildings, the trees. Everything is moving toward the same eventual end, at the same slow pace, with the same acceptance of what's coming. You help him more now, without being asked. You carry the heavy things and reach the high branches and dig the holes that need digging. He accepts this help without comment, without thanks, the way he accepts everything, as simply another fact about the world, another thing to be incorporated into the endless work of living. But sometimes, in the evenings, sitting by the fire that's smaller now because he can't gather as much wood, he'll look at you with an expression you can't quite read, and you'll feel something pass between you that feels like gratitude, or maybe just acknowledgement. You're here. You've stayed. That matters, even if neither of you will ever say so. The garden will outlast him, you think. The trees certainly will, most of them. The cottage might, if someone keeps repairing it, or might slowly return to the earth, stone by stone, until there's nothing left but a slight irregularity in the clearing where a foundation once stood. And you'll be gone too, eventually, back to your own life with whatever you've learned here stored somewhere deep inside you, waiting to be useful when you need it. But for now, in this moment, you're both still here, still together, still watching the fire burn down and the stars come out and another day end in the only place either of you really belongs. The end comes quietly, as endings often do in places like this. You find him one morning in the vegetable patch, kneeling among the cabbages as though he'd simply stopped to rest and forgotten to get up again. His eyes are open, looking at something you can't see, and his hands are still half raised in the gesture of someone about to pick something, to tend something, to continue the endless work of caring for this place. You kneel beside him and touch his shoulder, and he's cold, colder than the morning air can account for, and you understand that he's been here for hours, maybe all night, watching the stars wheel overhead while the life slowly left his body. The cabbages around him are untouched, unharvested, still growing toward a future he won't share. You sit with him for a long time, not sure what to do, not sure what comes next. The birds sing. The sun rises. The world continues as though nothing has changed. And in a way, nothing has. The garden is still here. The cottage is still here. The trees are still growing. Only one small thing is missing. one small presence that made all the difference. You bury him in the grove he planted, under the central hawthorn where you found him that winter night so many years ago. It feels right, though you're not sure why, something about returning him to the place he made, the living thing he created that will outlast him by decades or centuries. You dig the hole yourself, slowly, giving the work the same attention he gave everything, feeling the soil change as you go deeper, dark and rich near the surface where the leaves have fallen and rotted for years, paler and harder below, finally the clay that underlies everything here. You wrap him in his own blanket, the one he carried here 40 years ago, and lower him into the ground and cover him with the same soil he's worked for most of his adult life. You mark the spot with a stone from his collection, the spiral fossil he kept on the windowsill, and you stand there for a long time not knowing what to say, what to do, how to end something that never really had a beginning. The question of what he left behind is harder than you expected. There's no will, no instructions, no list of wishes for what should happen to this place. There's just the garden, the cottage, the trees, and you, temporary custodian of something you didn't build and don't fully understand. You stay for a while, tending things as he would have tended them, trying to feel his presence in the work the way you always did. But it's not the same. The silence is different now, emptier, less companionable. The garden doesn't need you the way it needed him. The trees don't know your name. The cottage feels like a museum, a monument to a life that's over, not a home for a life that's still being lived. You know you'll have to leave eventually, return to your own world, your own life, whatever's left of it after all these years away. But not yet. Not quite yet. There's still work to do here. Still things that need attention before you can let them go. Historians still argue about what his life meant, what legacy he left behind, whether any of it mattered in the great sweep of human history. You think about this as you walk through the garden one last time, touching the plants he planted, feeling the soil he worked, remembering the hundreds of small moments that added up to a life. He didn't write books or found institutions or change any laws. He didn't have children or students or followers. He didn't do anything that will appear in history books or get taught in schools. But he did something else, something harder to measure. He lived a life of complete integrity, every moment aligned with his deepest values, every action and expression of who he really was. He showed that it's possible to opt out, to say no to the endless demands and distractions of the world, to build something real and lasting with nothing but patience and attention and time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. You find the letter in the wooden box, the one from his sister, still folded in its original creases, still carrying the sketch of 2 children in a garden. You take it with you when you leave, along with the spiral fossil and a small cutting from the hawthorn tree. You don't know why. Some things don't need reasons. The path to the clearing is almost gone now, grown over so thoroughly that you have to push through branches and step over fallen logs to find your way out. By the time you reach the edge of the woods, you can barely see where you came from. By the time you reach the road, you're not sure it was ever there at all. But you carry the proof in your pocket, the fossil, the cutting, the letter from a sister who probably died years ago, never knowing what became of her brother. You'll plant the cutting somewhere. You decide. Somewhere it can grow, can become part of a different garden, can carry a little piece of this place into whatever future awaits. And you'll tell the story, sometimes, to people who might understand. Not the whole story. You're not sure you know the whole story anymore. Just enough to let them know that such a life is possible, that somewhere in the woods of Surrey an old man once chose silence over everything else, and that his choice mattered, even if no one can say exactly why. You close the gate behind you, and the sound of it, that same groaning hinge you heard what feels like a lifetime ago, echoes through the quiet evening air. The latch falls into place with a soft click, and you stand there for a moment with your hands still resting on the wood, feeling the roughness of it against your palm, the warmth left by the day's sun. Through the gaps in the boards you can see the path leading back into the woods, the way almost invisible now, just a slight thinning of the undergrowth where feet once trod. You won't come back here. You know that, somehow, with the same certainty that you know the sun will rise tomorrow and set again tonight. This visit is over, this chapter closed, this life finished in every way that matters. The garden will continue without you for a while, a season, maybe two, and then it will slowly return to wilderness, the vegetables choked by weeds, the fruit fallen and rotting, the cottage claimed by damp and rot and the slow, patient work of decay. By the time anyone finds this place again, if anyone ever does, there will be nothing left but a clearing in the woods and a few old trees planted in patterns that might seem accidental to anyone who doesn't know what they mean. You turn away from the gate and start walking, the road stretching ahead of you toward whatever comes next. The evening is warm, almost too warm, the kind of late summer evening that seems to last forever, the light lingering long after it should have faded. Crickets are beginning their nightly chorus in the hedgerows, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks once and then falls silent. You walk slowly, not because you're tired but because you want to feel every step, want to stretch this moment out as long as possible before you have to re-enter the world you left behind. Your pocket is heavy with the things you brought, the fossil, the cutting wrapped in damp cloth, the letter from a sister to a brother who never answered. Small things, probably meaningless to anyone else. But to you they're everything, the only physical proof that any of it happened, that a man once lived alone in the woods for 40 years and let you share some of that time with him. The road leads eventually to a village, and the village has an inn, and the inn has a room with a bed that's softer than anything you've slept on in years. You lie there that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. The last voices from the taproom below, the creak of stairs, the hoot of an owl from somewhere in the darkness. It's too soft here, you think. Too warm, too dry, too far from the sounds you've grown used to. The wind in the trees, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the crackle of a fire burning low. You miss the cottage already, miss the bench under the oak, miss the garden and the grove and the old man who never spoke but somehow said everything that mattered. You reach into your pocket and touch the fossil, running your finger along the spiral, and you feel something loosen in your chest, something that's been tight since you found him among the cabbages. He's still here, you realize. Not in any physical way, but in the memory of him that you carry, in the things he taught you without ever meaning to, in the way you'll see the world differently now because of the time you spent in his silence. Historians still argue about whether such lives have meaning, whether one man's quiet existence in the woods can matter in a world full of wars and discoveries and great events. You think about this as you lie there in the too soft bed, and you come to your own conclusion, the only one that makes sense to you. His life mattered because it was lived. Because every day he woke and worked and watched and waited, fully present in a way that most of us never manage for more than a few scattered moments. Because he showed that another way is possible, that you can step off the treadmill and build something real with nothing but time and attention and the willingness to be alone with yourself. Because he left behind not books or monuments, but a question that will occur to everyone who hears his story, who learns that somewhere in the woods of 18th century England a man chose silence over everything else. The question is simple and impossible, and you'll carry it with you for the rest of your life. What would it take for you to do the same? The cutting goes into the ground the next morning, in a corner of your own small garden that faces east, that gets the morning sun the way the clearing did. You water it carefully, the way he would have, and you wait. It takes weeks to show any sign of life, and you almost give up hope, but then one morning you notice tiny green buds at the tips, and you feel something swell in your chest that might be joy or might just be relief. The hawthorn will grow here, in this different soil, this different climate, this different world. It will never be as tall as the one in the grove, probably, but it will live, and every spring it will flower, and every autumn it will fruit, and every year you'll look at it and remember. The fossil sits on your windowsill, next to the plants you're learning to grow, next to the books you're learning to read differently. The letter stays in your pocket for a while, then moves to a drawer, then to a box, then to a place so safe you almost forget where you put it. But you never really forget. None of it. Not the sound of his voice that one night, not the way his hands moved among the plants, not the silence that was never really empty, never really lonely, never really anything except exactly what it needed to be. And so you close the gate, finally, and walk away, and the story ends the way all stories end, not with answers, but with questions. Not with conclusions, but with openings. Not with certainty, but with the quiet knowledge that some things can't be explained, only experienced, only carried, only passed along to whoever might be listening. The hermit in the garden is gone now, returned to the soil he worked, become part of the place he made. But his garden continues, in you, in the hawthorn cutting, in anyone who hears this story and pauses for a moment to wonder what it would be like to live so fully inside a single place, a single life, a single choice. You walk on, and the road stretches ahead, and the evening light softens into dusk, and somewhere behind you the gate stands closed, waiting for someone else to find it, someone else to open it, someone else to step through and discover what's been waiting there all along. Now, let the story settle around you like a soft blanket, the way evening settles over a quiet garden. You've walked a long path tonight, through woods and years and the silence of a life lived differently. Let your eyes grow heavy, your breathing slow, your thoughts drift like leaves falling from ancient oaks. The hermit rests now, in his grove under the hawthorn, and you rest too, wherever you are, carrying whatever piece of his garden you've chosen to bring with you. The gate is closed, the journey done, the story told. Sleep well, and let the quiet hold you.